Hey, hello Bio 2, this is Mr. B, and we're going to finish up with our first section here in Chapter 24, and we're going to look at today the life cycle of angiosperms. So, life cycle of angiosperms are, remember, those are flowering plants. So, reproduction in angiosperms takes place within the flower. So, following pollination and fertilization, the seeds develop inside protective structures. So, that's just kind of basic overview of what we're going to see. So the first picture we're going to look at, this is a picture of the angiosperm life cycle, again characterized by alternation of generations and having a sporophyte and a gametophyte stage. So we're going to take a look at this, kind of what it means in words. So don't forget this picture, it'll show up in your notes, but we'll take a look at it in words because it might make a little more sense. So each flower, kind of going on how we're going to start with how they reproduce. Each flower contains anthers and an ovary, which we talked about yesterday. And inside the anthers, each cell undergoes meiosis and produces haploid spore cells. So remember, meiosis is how our sex cells reproduce. And each spore cell becomes a single pollen grain. So there's our first step, making our pollen grain. So that is our haploid stage. The pollen grain will usually stop growing until it is released from the anther and deposited on the stigma. Remember, we said the stigma was kind of our area that was going to be sticky, and so it's usually going to keep growing until it is deposited there. And so then that is kind of that's just how our male structures are produced within the flowering plants. So our female structures are going to occur in the ovule, and that's going to be a single diploid cell. Remember, we start with diploid, undergoes meiosis to produce 4 haploid cells. So that's just the basic meiosis kind of properties there and characteristics. So 1 cell turning into 4. And then only one of these 4 cells undergoes mitosis to produce 8 nuclei. And these 8 nuclei in the surrounding membrane are called the embryo sac. So one of these cells, only one of 4, is going to undergo mitosis to produce these 8 nuclei, and this is going to form the embryo sac. And this embryo sac will become what is our female gametophyte. And one of the 8 nuclei is one of the 8 nuclei is the egg nucleus, the female gamete. So what this is saying is we start with 1 cell. 1 cell turns into 4. 4 cells turn into 8. So these 8 make up the embryo sac. And of these 8, only 1 will become the egg nucleus and 1 will become the female gamete. So we go 1, 4, 8, then back down to 1. And then when fertilization takes place, this cell becomes the zygote that grows into the new sporophyte plant. So remember, that's going back to one of those 8 original cells. One of them gets fertilized and becomes our sporophyte plant. And so fertilization in angiosperm, so how that actually happens is if a pollen grain lands on the stigma of a flower of the same species, it grows a pollen tube. So that's our self-pollination that we talked about. This pollen tube grows into the style, reaches the ovary, and enters the ovule. So that's just passing through all the female reproductive parts in order to reach our female gametophyte, which we just talked about. And one of the sperm nuclei fuses with the egg nucleus to produce a diploid zygote, and this zygote will go into the new plant embryo. However, now this is up to this point, it's been kind of about the same as the other plants. However, this is where it kind of changes. So the other sperm nucleus fuses with 2 polar nuclei in the embryo sac to form a triploid. So this is the first time we've heard triploid cell. And that is going to be a 3N cell. And this cell will grow into a food-rich tissue known as endosperm. So that's very important, which nourishes the seedling as it grows. So endosperm is going to be an important thing. And that comes from the formation of a sperm not fusing with the egg, it's fusing with 2 polar nuclei. And what polar nuclei are just nuclei that don't really have a function in terms of reproduction. However, it comes into play because it forms basically a food source for our developing plant. And because 2 fertilizations take place between the male and female gametophytes, This process is known as double fertilization. So this is a big difference between angiosperms and the rest of the plants, is this double fertilization. So that's important, no double fertilization. So to wrap this chapter up, or not this chapter, this section, we're going to talk about pollination differences between our two seed plants, between the angiosperms and the gymnosperms. So in most gymnosperms and some angiosperms are wind pollinated, whereas most angiosperms are pollinated by animals. So I think we mentioned before, gymnosperms are almost solely wind, and there are some angiosperms that are wind, but most angiosperms are going to be by animals. So by animals. So wind pollination, just looking at, is kind of less efficient than animal pollination because it kind of relies on the weather, and you never know what you're going to get from day to day. Whereas animal pollination is kind of more effective because plants have developed bright colors and sweet nectar to attract the animals. So it's pretty easy for the animals just to walk up and kind of almost like they're getting a meal there, and then they disperse and pollinate the seeds. And this benefits both the plants and the animals that pollinate them. So that's a symbiotic relationship, if you remember that word. So that's it for section 1.